Good morning, all. We'll try and get this thing up. There we go. So, as promised, a little podcast quickly on energy transformations. This will help particularly with our next SAC. I should probably try and get a podcast done for the SAC too today, shouldn't I, before we'll go on camp next week. Anyway, chapter 3, all about energy transformations. And so we did a little bit of work first, just to sort of background some of that physics. Because as we discussed this week, being a biologist requires some knowledge of physics and chemistry because we're applying them in the context of living things and the manner in which living things interact with each other and of course the world itself, as you would have done last year in year 11 in unit 2. So energy exists in many forms: light, heat, sound, mechanical, electrical, chemical, kinetic. So energy, so why physicists like to tell us that they're more important than everyone else, because energy is at the basis of everything. And I'm probably whispering, I don't know, to my microphone a bit closer. So, the law of conservation of energy, stolen, of course, from Lavoisier's law of conservation of mass, states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, simply transferred or transformed. And so we're looking at transformations of light energy from our sun, arriving on the planet and being used by plants to transform that energy into originally stored chemical energy, and then in time we'll make ourselves some available chemical energy through mitochondria and cell respiration. So green plants transform light energy in the chloroplast, and then plants and animals take that and convert that stored energy into heat, sound, kinetic energy, and all those other forms in the mitochondria. Well, we'll go into more details that go along. So, there we go, that worked. Interesting, the second law of thermodynamics states that entropy, chaos, is increasing, will always increase. So we think Big Bang, tiny little infinitesimal, what's the word for it? Can't think of it now, happens, boom, and ever since we're becoming less and less organized, more and more random. So entropy is all about this idea of that randomness. And the theory is that eventually we'll stop. 10,000 trillion years' time, it'll be so chaotic, entropy is such a state that nothing will happen anymore and will be at absolute zero. The whole universe will be at absolute zero and there'll be no energy to drive anything. That's a long way away, so we won't worry too much about that just now. But we do see in our biological systems this incredible inefficiency. We're inefficient from the moment the sunlight arrives. So if we call the sunlight arriving on a particular day 100%, about 1% is trapped in photosynthesis, and the rest is reflected back into space. So we lose 99% of the energy that arrives every day. And this, of course, is what is driving a lot of research into solar cells and wind and tidal energy, because the wind and the tides are driven by sun energy as well. If we can trap, just another 1%, the planet for the last, well, what are we talking about, 3.8 billion years of life on the planet has been driven by that 1%. So if we can do better than 1%, surely we can do better than digging up fossil fuel. Anyway, stop the lesson. Proselytizing. So of that 1% that's trapped in photosynthesis, about 40% of that's released in cell respiration. So there's this whole lot of heat that's lost from that too. So it's hugely inefficient. So the original energy that arrives each day, 0.004% is actually used. So this is this idea of the inefficiencies of the system and the entropy within the system. So, a little summary: energy cannot be created or destroyed. Free energy is energy available to do work. When energy is transformed, some energy is always lost, and it's usually heat, which of course is useful because that's how we maintain ourselves as endergonic organisms. Exergonic reactions result in a net release of energy, and endergonic reactions require an input of energy to occur. Endothermic, I call myself endergonic, didn't I? So endothermic organisms like ourselves are using that heat, that waste heat, if you like, to maintain our body temperatures. All energy transformations obey the law of thermodynamics. And so the amount of free energy in the universe has been declining for, what's that now? Somewhere between 15 and 20 billion years, and can only go on for so long. But to the biology. So all living organisms contain a mitochondria that allows them to do cellular respiration. And I stress the cellular because if you don't write cellular on your exam paper, then you will not get the full marks. Respiration is simply breathing. So we require energy in the form of ATP to then control our processes. And the mitochondria is where we take glucose and create that ATP. So we've got a nice little diagram there showing glycolysis occurring in the cytosol outside of the mitochondria. In year 11, you would have looked quite a bit at the idea of fermentation or anaerobic respiration occurring outside the mitochondria. We don't tend to fuss too much about that in year 12. The exam questions tend to be much more around aerobic. So in the presence of enough oxygen, the pyruvate that's created from the breakdown of the glucose is transferred into the mitochondria. There's a cost of energy to do that. So the net gain of ATP from glycolysis is simply 2 units of ATP. And we've got some electrons then being carried by NADs, which are now NADHs, which will enter the electron transport chain later on. So our pyruvate enters Kreb cycle. In Kreb cycle, it's broken down further, and we get more NADs and FADs released, and more ATP, just 2 more ATP. So we've got 4 ATP net so far. And then in the electron transport chain, we see all those NADs and FADs donating their hydrogen ions to allow ADP, adenosine diphosphate, to become ATP, so that the hydrogen ions release their energy to allow phosphorus to be taken up by the ADP and become ATP. And then we break down ATP to run other processes. I did play the cell respiration song, so you can always go online and hear Stephen Sue singing his wonderful cell respiration song. We won't do that here, it's too embarrassing. So cell respiration commences in the cytosol, as we discussed, and then finishes off in Krebs and electron transport in the mitochondria. And you do need to know that standard summary statement. C6H12O6 plus 6O2 react to produce 6CO2 plus 6H2O and energy as ATP, 36 to 38 units. Hasn't been on the exam for a little while, but it's still required of you. You should know that. And it should be it's a balanced equation. It's just a summary of a lot of other stuff that's going on. So glycolysis literally means splitting up glucose molecules. And one glucose molecule will give us 2 pyruvates, 2 NADH hydrogen acceptors, and, well, a bit more than 2 molecules of ATP, but the net gain is 2 ATP. We're only really worried about the gain. If adequate oxygen is present, then we continue on into the mitochondria. Of course, in the absence of oxygen, then we go into lactic acid production in animals, and of course alcohol and carbon dioxide in plants, which we use now so many of our systems for making bread and cheese and things, beer, wine. Kreb cycle, as you can see in that diagram, Kreb cycle is a lot more complex than you need to worry about for your exam, but you'll see there's a whole lot of enzymes driving this Kreb cycle, and it is truly a cycle of chemicals coming into the mitochondria and being spread around, letting the hydrogen ions free, and we get a couple of ATPs given off as well. So the pyruvate and NADH transfer the membrane. It's actually called the cristae of the mitochondria, and that costs that 2 ATPs. The pyruvate and NADH are transformed into acetyl coenzyme A molecules. 4 electron carriers become charged, and the NADHs and FADs. CO2 is produced, 2 of them so far. I think the other ones have come. No, might come later. And 2 more units of ATP. So you need to know the inputs and outputs, basically. Into electron transport with that wonderfully complex diagram. And again, our good friend Paul Anderson at Bozeman Biology did a lovely little podcast explaining by drawing. One day I'll learn how to draw on my computer, drawing on the screen and showing what was happening with these hydrogen ions being created. But essentially, the NADHs and FADHs are donating electrons into the system, and you see this huge build-up of hydrogen ions on one side. And I point to the screen now, but it won't mean much. But on the far right-hand side, there's a ATP synthase complex. The hydrogen ions pump back through that synthase complex and cause ADPs to pick up a phosphorus ion and become ATPs. So we get leftover water from all that process, and we get between 32 and 34 molecules of ATP. and this occurs within the mitochondria as well. So respiration. Before I do that, the things you need to know for your exam, you need to think about where things are occurring, what the inputs are, what the outputs are, and how much energy is produced at each stage. They're the things you'll get examined on. And it's the same for photosynthesis. There's 2 stages of photosynthesis, and within those 2 stages there are inputs and outputs, and you need to know those. And of course I've played that lovely photosynthesis song for you a couple of times now, just to embed it in your minds. And so you should all be able to say photosynthesis, shouldn't you? Anyway, less embarrassing for myself. The summary of photosynthesis, against a summary chemical reaction, is better described as 6 CO2 plus 12 H2O. If you put 6 H2O on your exam paper, it's okay, just don't include it on the other side. And so they react to produce, in the presence of light and chlorophyll, and that's the 2 bits that students always forget to include, they'll produce glucose, 1 glucose molecule, C6H12O6, 6 water as waste, metabolic waste, we talk about metabolic waste a lot, and of course 6 oxygen, which has allowed the planet to run a bit better with oxygen in the atmosphere. I don't know what's happened to that sentence on the bottom there. May I fix it since that happened? Anyway, this of course takes place in the chloroplast. We've got lots of enzymes running it as well. 2 stages, light dependent stage. So chlorophyll traps light energy, and that uses that energy to in fact lyse the water molecules. So it's hydrolysis. We break the hydrogen bonds, and we've got charged hydrogen particles and oxygen as waste. And this occurs on the grana, or the thylakoid stacks, thylakoid membranes within the chloroplast. And then in the second stage, oops, that work? No, do a little too far now. Back up. In light independent stage, this occurs without necessarily having light, which is a really useful adaptation. Those plants that live in desert country and have a problem with waste being lost, or low light conditions, and continue to photosynthesize in low light. And we talk about it in class. So the ATP made in the first stage is used to combine the carbon from carbon dioxide with the hydrogen ions that you've got from breaking up the water and creating that glucose molecule. And of course you have water and as waste at this stage. So the oxygen's the waste from the first stage, light dependent, and the water's the waste from the second stage, so light independent. So if your stomata are closed, you can't lose water and oxygen from the plant. And we talked about that in class, how that was really important for some plants. So what can affect the rate at which photosynthesis will occur? Well, clearly you need carbon dioxide, and you need light, and of course you need water. So those 3 things need to be present and have chlorophyll present as a catalyst for it to occur at all. There's also affected by light intensity. So as the light builds during the day, we get greater light intensity and greater production of glucose. But it'll stop at some point. There'll be too much light for the amount of CO2 available, maybe all the amount of water available. And temperature. So the enzymes that control photosynthesis work best between 20 and 40 degrees Celsius. So on particularly hot days, they'll slow down anyway. On particularly cold days, they'll slow down. And most plants will form dormancy during cold and heat, either to protect themselves from low energy production, and so they're wasting more energy staying alive than they're gaining from photosynthesis. You see those plants lose their leaves. Or in the case of Australian plants, of course, above 40 degrees and low water content in the soil tends to mean they become dormant across summer and don't produce much energy at all because they can't afford to. And so, of course, Australian plants tend to lose their leaves in summer too. So Dad's probably on the gutter, up on the roof, getting the gutters clean because his gum trees have been dumping leaves in his gutters all summer. Well, he should be. In fact, so should I on the holidays. So storing energy. Plants create glucose in photosynthesis. So the excess glucose is first stored as starch in leaves. And yesterday we did that experiment destarching our leaves and showing how they no longer contain the starch by use of iodine. And of course they also store them in the ground, in tubers. You can't really call fruit as a storage because it's really about attracting someone to disperse your seeds. But obviously excess starch can be used for that purpose then. That's a good way of getting someone to come along and take your seeds somewhere else. There's a lot of energy being used to create dispersal.